paper while I'm presenting. If some Henrys pop into your head that you think might be on a postage stamp, then write them down. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to go through a list of about 22 Henrys that are on stamps and see if how many you came up with. I will have to give you one warning about the post office policy. They only put dead people on stamps. So if you're thinking of an American who would be on a stamp, that person has to be deceased. But other countries don't have the same rules. You can see here, Henry Fonda already added one to your list. Also, if there are any stamp collectors out there or people who used to collect stamps, stamps are a great way to learn history. And what we try to do every month is put out a calendar with a stamp that represents a historic event of the day. And so Monday through Friday, if you're looking for a way to celebrate, that calendar can help you. And if you just email us at info@spellman.org, be happy to put you on the mailing list to get a calendar each week. Okay, so let's get started with the program. Just some overviews of the post office. This was a nice set of stamps issued a while back, as you can see, when postage was 8 cents. And it just gives you all the various duties that postmen and post ladies have to take care of from the time you put it in the mailbox to the time it gets to the recipient. And of course, with the COVID, the post office was affected like everything else, but they delivered the mail. You remember that old saying, neither snow nor rain nor heat, and now not the pandemic. I know talked to a friend this morning who had a very late delivery for a Christmas pack, but generally the mail has been going through thanks to the work of all the essential workers at the post office. And this going back 100 years, this is what a mailman looked like during the last pandemic, what they called the Spanish influenza. Stamps are a way of recognizing current events as well, and a number of countries this past year have issued stamps related to the COVID-19. The most interesting one is that at the bottom you'll see an elephant, and you'll see a little set on the side. That's whole thing is not the stamp, but the whole piece of paper. Interestingly, they poked a little fun at the toilet paper shortage, and that stamp was actually printed on toilet paper. A couple of other countries. Some people, when they come to our museum, they always ask what Helvetia is. They haven't heard of that country, but that's Switzerland. The reason they don't call it Switzerland is because they speak 4 different languages in Switzerland. You can see them 4 different ones on the stamp. So they went back to the old Roman name for the Alps area where Switzerland is. And also in the news, our new Secretary of the Treasury is a philatelist, which just is a fancy name for a stamp collector. So a little bit about the museum. As I said, we're located not too far from Newton, right across the turnpike. And it's on Regis College. That's Cardinal Spellman there with his collection. He was a very influential cardinal in his time. He was the Archbishop of New York City, but he started his career right in Newton. Then he worked on the Pilot, the Catholic newspaper. And then in the late 30s, he was transferred down to New York City, became a cardinal in 1946, right after the war. And here he is, and he studied to be a priest in Rome, and that's where he picked up the stamp collecting habit. He also collected autographs and collected coins, but stamps were his main interest. And so he made a lot of friends, being a very influential pope, friends including Franklin Roosevelt. And so he got all his friends together and wanted to show his collection plus many other collections. And so they chartered the museum in 1960. And on his birthday, May 4th, 1963, he became the museum open. And it was a big, big celebration. The Postmaster General was there, about 1,000 people. Interestingly, one of our former board members was just about a 15-year-old at the time. He played the bugle, starting off the opening. So we've been there for a long time. The Cardinal's not on a stamp in America, but when he visited the Nicaragua back in the late 50s, they put him on a stamp. He collected a lot of his stamps during the war when he was traveling as the vicar for all the Catholic chaplains. He went over 44,000 miles, and he went over to Korea and Vietnam as well. There are some other interesting stamp museums and postal museums. This is a little one. It's not really a stamp museum. It's more having to deal with the delivery of the mail. And that's in a little town called Delphos, started by a retired postmaster. Of course, the major stamp museum is the Smithsonian, the National Postal Museum, which is in the old post office building down in Washington, D.C. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend a trip. It's fantastic. Much bigger than we are, but they have a much bigger budget. And then I put this picture in because right now I'm down in South Carolina in a town called Beaufort, and just up the road is Charleston, and they have this fantastic building, which is the old post office built around the turn of the century. And I put it in the show just to show you that, back then, post offices were much bigger institutions, and they would build post offices like this. Many cities have buildings this grand. All right, let's get into a little bit about the post office more. If you want to take a nice field trip this summer, head up to Hinsdale, New Hampshire. This is the oldest continuous post office in the United States, opened in 1816. Of course, there are a lot of post offices that are older, but this is the oldest one still sorting and delivering the mail. The smallest one, if you're down in Florida, go look at Ochapee, just 61.3 square feet. We jokingly say probably the size of an apartment in New York City. There used to be a smaller one out in California, but that closed, and so we give Florida the credit. And this is an interesting post office out in Bridal Veil, Oregon. I saw this story on the news a few years ago. It's a tiny little town. It really shouldn't even have a post office, but they like to postmark with a special bridal veil cancellation, as you can see there. And by the thousands, future brides send their invitations with the stamp on it to Bridal Veil to get this special cancellation. And they have a different one every year. So it's just using the post office and the post office also puts out special stamps just for wedding invitations. And then there's other towns that celebrate in their name. This is Noel, Missouri. People, again, send their Christmas cards there to get that cancellation. Or you can get even closer, go right up to New Hampshire, to Bethlehem, New Hampshire, and they will cancel it with the name of the town. And there's some other ones. There's a Santa Claus in Indiana, and a high school art student that does the design every year. And then the one that's a lot of fun at Valentine's Day is out in Loveland, Colorado. Again, they have a different cancellation every year. Send you Valentine cards, and volunteers will cancel them for you. Speaking of Valentine's Day, you may have purchased this stamp. This was this year's Valentine's Day stamp. Okay, the post office is in a little bit of trouble, mostly financial, but email has certainly cut down on the there. In fact, this pokes a little fun at the post office. We no longer have forever stamps. We now have just taking it day by day. But I predict the post office will still be around. But it is suffering from a lot of red ink. And there are efforts now that we have a little more sympathetic president towards the post office. Our postmaster general has been in a lot of controversy, but we're hoping that things can work out. But maybe the budget cuts right now are affecting some of that delivery. And this one I just found, a little one. Why did it take 7 weeks to receive a letter from Florida? He says, don't complain, it's as fast as I can walk. Although I will have to tell you, I was out in California last week, sent a postcard on Wednesday or Thursday to a friend in Holland. He received it Tuesday. So mail does get through. Some famous, well-known fiction mailmen. We have Cliffy from Mr. Rogers, who gets himself on a stamp, and the kind of evil mailman Newman from Seinfeld. Where did that expression come from? Neither rain nor sleet. Goes way back to the ancient Greeks, written by Herodotus. He was commenting on the Persian letter carriers that operated the system during the wars there. And then we have the famous post office, which is pretty much closed now down in New York City. It's now being turned into a train station for the extension of the Penn Central. But it was built back in 1912. As you can see, it is that grand building that I mentioned. The post office, the unofficial motto, neither rain nor sleet, is inscribed at the top of the building. Same person designed this building that did our own Boston Public Library. Has a very special zip code, 10001. And until about 10 years ago, it was open 24 hours a day. But again, the inside is being converted into a very beautiful design. It's just a shame to see post office go. And then because it's coming up tax day, although they've extended it a month. If you remember, you used to have to very often run to the post office at midnight to get a cancellation for April 15th. Many post offices stayed open late just to do that. They don't do it anymore because everybody files by internet. But this is also a revenue stamp. Stamps were used not just for postage, but also for proving taxes paid on certain things. You remember the old mailing playing cards had that blue strip on them. That was a revenue stamp. Some post offices have caused some controversy over murals that were painted back in the 30s and 40s. Some of the themes are not, as we used to say, like to say, politically correct. And so some of them, here's one down in North Carolina of the slaves picking cotton, and is concerned about possibly should they take that mural down. But we have some other murals that are not controversial. If you want to go up to some post offices in New Hampshire, you can see there. Vermont has about 7. You can see how grand they are in some of these post offices. And then Massachusetts, we have about 35, Rockport, Ipswich. And down in Falmouth, they have this interesting one above the postmaster's door. And about a year and a half ago, the post office issued stamps celebrating these murals. These are 5 different murals from around the country. Famous people who worked for the post office. You may know, some of you may have worked for the post office yourself, but you'd be in good company with these people, including Abraham Lincoln and Charles Lindbergh. And many of these people got themselves on postage stamps, not, I think, for working for the post office, but for what they accomplished. But interesting that post office is one of our biggest employers in the country, even more than Walmart. So it's a big operation. And so let's get into a little timeline. That's what this program is about, the history. The Pilgrims landed here in 1620. The Puritans came 10 years later. And by 1639, there was already a system now for getting information from England to the Mass Bay colony. And that the way it worked was there was a tavern, the Fairbanks Tavern, down in the Quincy Market area. And ship captains would come in. They'd pay the tavern owner a small fee to post the letters. And if people were expecting a letter from England, they'd go down to the tavern and pick it up or get the letter to who it was. As far as an official postal service, that started in 1673. You all, I think, are familiar, and not too far from us, the Boston Post Road. Well, that was, at that time, was called the King's Highway. But a fellow down in New York City, or New York at that time, Francis Lovelace, started the first official postal service between New York and Boston. It took about 2 weeks for mail to get from New York to Boston, then another 2 weeks to go back. There was some interruption in the service because the Dutch took over New York for a little while. There was some war with the Native Americans, but by 1707, this was an official postal system between Boston and New York. And as you can see, that there actually were three Boston Post roads. The one, Route 20, which is near us in Newton, a center trail, and then the lower one, which kind of was modeled on Route 1. Route 1 is modeled on that, I should say. They all got down to New Haven, and then from New Haven, they went down to New York City. And there were no carriages. It was all done by post riders. And these are just some books about the road, very interesting reading. William Penn kind of started his own postal service down in Pennsylvania, and down in Virginia and down south. Slaves were often used to deliver messages. But again, there wasn't much communication going on, and the different colonies weren't too interested in what the other colonies were doing at that time. Of course, Ben Franklin comes along, and he's appointed by the Royal Crown. He was a printer, which gave him the opportunity to send his newspapers at a very low cost. As a printer, one of the reasons he wanted to do the post office. But he instituted a number of improvements. He did go to every one of the colonies, and on the back of his carriage, he had this machine called an odometer. I think he may have even invented it. And he would lay out the postal routes because in those days you paid by the amount of distance you were going. So they would post these milestones along the post road, and you can still see some of them, especially on Route 20. This is not a very good one, but there were some better ones. Interestingly, they were made by the same people who made gravestones. Franklin also knew about the Gulf Stream because he had a relative who was in the whaling business down in Nantucket. And he learned about the Gulf Stream, and he got his ships to send the mail over to England, put them in the Gulf Stream, and got the mail delivered faster, which was already a theme. Kind of the theme of this whole program is getting the mail as fast as possible to the recipients. And then during the Revolution, of course, the colonists did not want the British controlling their post office, so they conceived a constitutional post, and William Goddard down in Rhode Island was made the first postmaster for the colonies. But a year later, Franklin was then appointed to head up the whole postal system. He only lasted about a year because he was sent over to France to seek money for the Revolution. But there are a number of stamps, obviously, honoring Ben Franklin. And as I said, newspapers were probably the most important thing that were carried by the letter carriers to get the news out. And then after the war, the mail started to be carried by coaches, some of them made up in New Hampshire, some of them very famous coaches. There was the Articles of Confederation. They did have a postal system, not very efficient. So when the Constitution was established in 1788-89, showing how important the post office was to the colonists, they actually put it in the Constitution that Congress was responsible for establishing post offices and post roads. And then by a few years later, they actually formalized it even more, Postal Act of 1792. George Washington was greatly in favor of it. He realized as president how important it was for the 13 and then 14, 15, 16 states to communicate. And then, of course, the country was expanding as well. These are kind of two stamps that explain that. Right after the war, people started going into what we called the Northwest Territory, which was Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and people were settling there. Then a few years later, the Louisiana Purchase opens up areas. So as these areas opened, Congress set up its post roads. And going in, there's a nice stamp celebrating Kentucky that was expanding and that. And then this is just a map of the colony or the states in 1804, basically showing all the postal routes. They kept growing every year. It was, and everybody wanted to have a post office, so that demanded more trails. Then they delivered the mail, first by horseback, then by carriages. Then a few years later, ferry boats were hired to carry the mail on a contract. And then the trains became important. 1632, they was the first carrying of the train, carrying the mail by train. They didn't sort it at that point. We'll see it a little bit, but they did. And this was the way to get the mail quickly as possible. Baltimore and Ohio being one of the first railroads. Then there was some controversy over slavery. Post office was not immune for that. Many abolitionists up north were sending down pro or anti-slavery literature. And in July of 1835, there was a mob down in Charleston, South Carolina, that actually grabbed all that literature and burned it up. And so the post office, although they were supposed to deliver all the mail, and that didn't quite always happen. Andrew Jackson, by the way, was president. And I'd like to point out a little thing. One of the nice reasons, again, studying stamps is there's this series of presidents on stamps from the late 1930s. And you notice that Andrew Jackson is on a 7-cent stamp. That wasn't the cost of just a letter, that was a little more, but the amount on the stamp was the number of the president. So George Washington was on a 1-cent stamp, Jackson's on a 7, Abraham Lincoln was on a 16-cent stamp. It was just a good way for children especially to learn the order of presidents. But speaking of Jackson, he was the more populist type president, and he kind of introduced the spoil system, which meant that politicians could appoint postmasters, which was a good job to have. Then before 1840, many people who come to the museum don't realize there were no postage stamps. The first postage stamps weren't issued till in England in 1840. The man who thought up the idea is on that stamp. His name is Roland Hill, and he came up with this very simple black stamp with Queen Victoria on it. It's called the one penny black. It is the oldest stamp in the world. They made millions and millions of them, so they're not unused ones are valuable, but ones that have been canceled sell for maybe $100, $200. And that's where the idea of stamps came. And before that, letters would look like this. They very often would write the amount of postage, and then the person getting the letter had to pay what was written on the envelope. So it's just the opposite of what we do today. And it was not, that's one of the reasons British wanted stamps, or some way of showing that the person had paid the post office. Stamps were the way to do it because they were losing lots of money. So Daniel Webster in this country heard about it, and he actually, in the same year, 1840, introduced a resolution in Congress to think about using some kind of postage stamps. But like today, Congress took a little while, and it wasn't until 1847 that America actually started issuing stamps. We had two stamps, a 5 cent and a 10 cent, because for a few years you paid by the distance. Unlike today, where you could send a letter from Newton to Wellesley for 55 cents or to Hawaii for 55 cents. Back then, you paid by the distance. I put that Andrew Jackson stamp in. That wasn't one of the first stamps, but Jackson had just died about 1845, very popular president, and there was some movement to put him instead of Ben Franklin on the stamp. But because it might have caused too much controversy, Franklin was put on the first stamp. Now, every country in the world has stamps. And back in almost 20 years ago now, the post office got the idea of forever stamps. Rather than planning to publish stamps and worry about the change in amounts, you buy a stamp today, put it in a drawer, you can use it 5, 10 years from now. You'll probably all remember having to add 1 and 2 cent stamps sometimes to old stamps. But you can also make your own stamp. This is the one exception to the rule that you must be dead. Companies like Zazzle or even the own post office, if you send them a digital picture, they will print up a stamp for you. And then the self-adhesive stamps. Here's the little girl, whoops. Self-adhesive stamps came about in 1974 was the first one. They weren't too successful. The glue didn't work very well. If you're a stamp collector, you all know what a stamp hinge is. It's the way you put your stamp into an album without damaging it. And the company that made the hinges made the adhesion for the first stamp. And that dove carrying a little peace sign, that's on the top of the weather vane on the Mount Vernon home of Washington, which is also on the stamp. But this would be the problem. So self-adhesive stamps certainly have made it a lot better. Some people got carried away with these stamps. This gentleman decorating his whole car with stamps, but not unusual to use stamps for all types of art projects. And then stamps have been helpful in getting charity, raising money for charity. Post office will sell stamps at the price plus a few more cents. And you may have bought some of these, helping out the breast cancer charity, the Alzheimer's Foundation, saving wild animals, and of course, money to raise for the victims of the 9/11. And other countries have done the same thing as the way of using postage stamps to raise. In California, thousands of people go walking out there. As soon as they got out there, they wanted to know what was happening back east. So they had to come up with a way of getting mail to them. The fastest way to get a letter from Boston to San Francisco was to put it on a ship, sail down to the Panama Isthmus, drop the mail off. Hopefully there'd be a service carrying the mail across the isthmus. Hopefully there'd be another ship on the other side to take the letter. But it would still take 3 months to get a letter. And the people in California were definitely wanting to know the news. And so in 1857, there was a southern route established to get the mail. This was kind of the first land delivery of postage. And then, of course, we all know about the Pony Express. Pony Express could get the mail from Sacramento from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California in 15 or 16 days. So if you lived in Boston, you'd put your letter in the post office. They put it on a train that took it to St. Joseph, Missouri, and then the rider would take it away. Kind of expensive, but California was so far away, and this is 1859, 1860. There was, of course, the Civil War was going to be starting. People in California wanted to know what was happening. In fact, there was some talk that California might have formed its own country if they hadn't gotten better information. But the telegraph comes along, invented by Samuel Morse. There are many telegraph wires in the eastern part, and so they started putting telegraph wires pretty much along the same route that the Pony Express. So after 18 months, there was no longer need for the Pony Express and the telegraph. Interestingly, the post office put money into the telegraph system, and we almost had a public telegraph system, but Western Union had a lot of pull, and so telegrams and telegraph went private. Unlike other countries, such as Australia, where the telegraph is run by the post office, which it is in many countries. So that was one of the four things that the post office did not get into, which they should have. Then 1863, another innovation, and that was delivering mail to your house. If you lived in a city which had more than 20,000 residents and you could have mail delivered to your house, the idea started in Cleveland and it grew to almost 800 cities by the turn of the century. One of the main reasons was the Civil War. People had to line up to get their mail at post offices. Well, if you had a relative in the army, you wanted to know what was happening, and you might have to line up and stand in line for a couple of hours before you got your letter. And then if you opened it, there was bad news or sad news. So the post office did not like people doing that. So they decided, let's get letters to people. And they had some requirements, but you had to have sidewalks and crosswalks. It had to be easy to deliver the mail. But then of course, the soldiers, if you know, we had this big debate in this country about mail-in ballots. Well, all the soldiers could send their ballots home from the war front. And it was a little easier to do than it would have been today because all the units were organized by states. If they didn't have a post office way of doing it, soldiers were actually sent home to vote. And they also, of course, wanted to get home news, and the special envelopes were printed, thousands of different illustrations on the envelope. These are quite big collector's items. And they were very patriotic. Some of them were anti. The Southern ones had some nasty things about Abraham Lincoln. But these are, as I said, we have a nice exhibit of these at the museum. And of course, the South couldn't use the post office, so they established their own post office. And they didn't have the same rule about having to be dead. So they put the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, they put him on their 5-cent stamp. And that statue to the right was the postmaster, Mr. Reagan, for the Southern Confederacy. Supposedly was an excellent postmaster general. He did get arrested after the war. They brought him right up here to Boston in Fort Warren. The Andrew Jackson stamp never got published, but he would have been on another Confederate stamp. But coins were in short supply during the Civil War, so stamps were used as a replacement. They put the stamps inside these little containers, and the value of the stamp was equal to what it would have been for a coin. In fact, even today, stamps are considered legal tender, and you can use them for making payments. When I was a kid, I remember sending away for things from the cereal boxes, and you could send either 25 cents, you could send a quarter, or you could send 25 cents in stamps. A couple of other innovations, money orders came about. It was not too safe to send money through the mail. The post office realized this, so they started the money order system. And then to speed the mail, again, that theme of getting the mail there faster, they decided not only to carry the mail by train, but actually sort it on the train. So you'd pick up the mail and hopefully get it all sorted for delivery to the next towns coming down the line. And to speed things up even further, the train didn't stop to pick up its mail. It would just they'd put the mail in these bags, and as the train came by, a metal arm would swipe it, and then they just throw the other mail off the train to speed things up. Then the country gets even more united in 1869 with the Transcontinental Railroad, and again, more and more mail is being delivered around the country. Then there were some other innovations. to make sending letters cheap for a penny. They introduced postcards, uh, and then picture postcards came along a little later. You could only use the postcard for a message on the back, but eventually postcards became. And then there was another little problem with people's handwriting, hard to decipher where the letter was supposed to go. So they did set up what was called the dead letter office, and that was as early as 1825. But they found out that women were much more adept and able to read and determine where a letter might go than men were. So this is a turn of the century picture of the dead letter office trying to, but they will try to get a letter to everybody. And if they have to, they will open the letter to see if there's an address inside. Then a man named Montgomery Blair, you may know the Blair House, where the vice president lives, I believe, will be living. He was the postmaster general for Abraham Lincoln, and he had some innovations. And one of them was to unite the world in delivering mail. If you sent letters to other countries, you'd have to pay extra money for them to deliver it. So he came up with this idea of a universal postal system. He didn't live to see it actually established in 1874, but he was the kind of the brainchild. We'll deliver your mail if you deliver our mail at no extra charge, and that's how mail gets delivered around the world today. And Mr. Blair, famous not only in America for this, but appears on some other foreign stamps. Then Christmas cards come along, and they were first started in England, but in 1874, a man named Louis Prang started printing them out in Worcester, and before you know it, they were popular. Even today, although there were far less than were sent a couple of years ago, over 1 billion Christmas cards were mailed. And that stamp there is one of Prang's designs for a Christmas card. Notice also there's no denomination on this stamp. This was printed just as the postal rate was changing, but they didn't know what it was going to be yet, but they needed to get out new stamps. Then there's mail order catalogs, kind of the present day Amazon, you might say. And mail order, Sears Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, they deliver the catalogs, and then there would be private deliveries. We'll see more about that in a minute. Then a interesting law comes along, the Comstock Law. And there was kind of censorship of the mails and also prohibiting things from going through the mail. Any material that was considered obscene or lewd or lascivious, immoral, indecent, they were denied, put in the forefront by various anti-vice societies. A little ironic, you couldn't send any information about birth control through the mail. And 100 years later, post office issues a stamp celebrating family planning. Then postage due stamps came along to kind of unify collecting stamp letters that didn't have enough postage. And then 1895, earlier, I say, they started carrying the mail on trolley cars around cities. So you could mail your letter on one corner and you could get to another part of the city and the letter would be delivered the same day. And they would cancel over up to 2,000 letters per hour. And this was done in a number of cities. And then a man named Mr. Wanamaker comes along. You might recognize that name, the Wanamaker department stores down in Philadelphia. Well, he was a friend of Benjamin Harrison, contributed to his campaign. And Harrison, the post office needed some upgrading, so he hired Wanamaker to make some improvements. One of the improvements he had was delivering mail by pneumatic tubes under cities. And then sent across town and delivered in a, so and supposedly even a cat one time was stuck in there. I don't know how true that story is that I found. It became a little expensive, and not that many cities had it, but still it was another way of getting that mail as fast as possible. And this stamp is just kind of interesting. This is actually a postage stamp that would be used in Italy. They had the same pneumatic mail, and this would be a special stamp just for pneumatic mail. We did not do that in this country. Then commemorative stamps come about, another idea of Wanamaker's, and Christopher Columbus celebration in Chicago was taking place in 1893, so they issued this set of stamps. Interestingly, the first woman on an American stamp was not an American, but it was Queen Isabella who gave Christopher Columbus money to go exploring. And then another innovation that Wanamaker did, he was fought by this. A lot of people in Congress didn't want it, thought it'd be too expensive. But the National Grange, which is a big organization of farmers, especially back then, encouraged to get the mail delivered to your house, just like it was in the cities. Now they wanted it to your house. So in West Virginia in 1896, started experimenting with rural delivery, and another 20 years, carried all over the whole country. And they carried mail in all different ways. And then, as I mentioned, the mail order catalogs, but the packages were being delivered by private. Wanamaker said, why can't we do it publicly? And so he started the idea of packages, and later after he left office, and these are all the stamps that were used just on packages. And then if you didn't put enough, they put these postage due package stamps. But now, even today, you can still send unusual packages through the mail. This is a container of chicks. Chicks can survive up to 2 days being delivered in the mail. This is an aluminum case to carry eggs that the farmers' wives. They made them as many as 15 dozen to carry eggs. Bees can be sent through the mail, not all the bees, but the queen bee. And college students, especially the boys, I guess, who went home, sent their laundry home in special cases that the post office recognized. Send your laundry home, put some stamps on it to get back to the dormitory, and another way. And even children there was no rule against sending a child, and some people tried it. There was a little girl in Idaho, I'm sorry, who actually couldn't afford a train ticket, so her parents mailed her to grandma. This stopped pretty soon after this happened. Then there was the problem of segregation in the post office, especially down south. Many Southerners did not want African Americans being postmasters. They drove a number of them out of town, including this lady, Minnie Cox. Teddy Roosevelt heard about it, and he closed the post office down there. But there were some even more serious situations where some postmasters even got lynched. President Wilson comes along and segregates the government, and including the post office. So the black workers, and there were quite a few of them, formed their own union, very influential union. So influential, if you're familiar with Frederick Douglass, at his funeral, many of the pallbearers were members of that union of African postal workers. Postal rates went up during the war to pay for the war. Beautiful stamp there, but they went down again. Then airmail comes along. Back in 1911, they tried sending some mail, but again, the post office seems to have come up with a lot of resistance from Congress, especially, mostly over cost. And so it wasn't until 1918 that airmail became official. And if you know anything about rare stamps, this is the famous inverted Jenny. There's only 100 of these stamps, and the one just recently sold for $1 million. Then another way, because there were no radios, no radar, the pilots had to rely on ground information. And so these towers were put up along the airmail routes with arrows on the ground pointing either north and south or east and west. And if you go out to Utah, Nevada, California, you can still find some of these arrows. And that was the way the pilots could follow their route. And they also used the railroad tracks as they're following. Charles Lindbergh was one of the famous airman pilots before he flew across there. I put this stamp in. It's kind of cute. If any of you like cats, and I assume most of you do, notice that little pussy cat on the right-hand side of the stamp. According to stamp catalogs, this was the first stamp to feature a cat. The reason it's on the Lindbergh stamp was that Lindbergh was asked when he was getting ready to take off for Paris, is he taking his cat along? And of course, his comment was, oh no, it would be far too dangerous a trip. But the cat didn't make it, but did get on the stamp. Then there was delivering a mail by Zeppelins. You all know the famous Hindenburg that crashed in 1937. That hands are holding a letter that was on the Hindenburg that survived the mail and actually got delivered, even though it was burnt. And some of you may remember it used to cost more to send an airmail letter, so you get these special envelopes that folded, so you weren't paying for the weight of an envelope, which would have been just a waste of money. The Marines had to be called in for a few years. There were a lot of robberies going on the mail train, so the Marines had to come in and protect the mail delivery. And then by 1923, everybody had to have a mailbox. If you didn't have a mailbox, you wouldn't get mail delivered to your house. There was another fast way of getting mail to people from Europe. These were called catapult mail. And what would happen is the mail would be on the ship, and when the ship got within about 400 miles of the coast, mainly New York, they'd load up the plane with mail, put it on a catapult, shoot it off, and the mail would get there a day or two early. Again, another example of getting the mail as fast as possible. Then, of course, mailboxes started appearing on the streets. There were different types. We had ones there on the four-legged, probably around turn of the century. During World War II, and afterwards, some of them were painted green, because there was so much green paint left over from the war. And you may remember those red, white, and blue mailboxes, and then, of course, the ubiquitous blue box that we have now. Another type of mailbox that's not used anymore because of fire hazards, but in hotels and office buildings, these beautiful shafts for delivering mail. And you may recognize this old blue one. These aren't around anymore, but they were very popular for getting mail. And you can see one there in this old photograph. And we even had dancing mailboxes during the last election when there was all the protest about mailing ballots. We'll skip these two. Franklin Roosevelt was a big stamp collector, and that's what got a lot of kids interested. Interestingly, this man in the middle, Captain Tim, he had a national radio show, believe it or not, all about stamps, explained what they were about and all the pictures on them. And if you sent in some ivory soap labels, he'd send you some free stamps. And of course, Roosevelt, being a collector, as I said, encouraged the hobby of stamp collecting. And just like those trolleys we saw a little earlier, we started getting mail by buses around the cities, put it on one bus stop and would get to somebody else in the city. V-mail, some of you might remember this as children. It was too costly and too much weight to send real letters. So what they did was you'd write your letter on these special V-mail envelopes, fold it over. They would be photographed on microfilm, sent over to the soldiers in Europe or the Pacific. Then they would take the picture off the microfilm, and you get a smaller letter. It would look like this. So it would a mail bag was about 70 pounds, but you could get about 1,000 letters on just a simple small roll of microfilm, and so the letters would get more important. And this would be something that the soldiers would see. And of course, mail after ammunition, and food. Mail is the most important thing, including magazines. Time magazine actually published a special soldiers edition, no advertising, and it was smaller, so it could be mailed. And of course, love letters were very important during the war. Seal SWAK. Anybody know what that means? It would be sealed with a kiss. It would be how the ladies might sign their letters. And you can see mail call being a very important part of a soldier's life. Soldiers could get mail if they were captured by the Germans. The Red Cross would see if letters would get delivered, but you could not send a letter to a captive with that win the war stamp. That was considered by the Germans propaganda, and they would not deliver any letters that had that stamp on it. You had to use a different stamp. And of course, much of the mail was censored going both ways because it was wartime. And of course, when more men in the army, so more women started delivering mail. And some of you may remember this movie, Miracle on 34th Street. I include it only because it shows how the post office was so important. If you know the theme, there's a man named Kris Kringle who says he's Santa Claus. He's taken to court to prove that he's not Santa Claus, but they use the post office to prove that he is. They take all the letters written to Santa Claus that were piling up in the New York City post office, delivered it to the courtroom, and the lawyer said, if the post office delivered these letters to this man, he must be Santa Claus. The judge agreed, and there was a Santa Claus. There were some unsuccessful ways to deliver mail, such as rockets. Didn't quite work too well. But mail has been carried other than by mailmen and trucks, by reindeer, dog sled up in Alaska till just a few years ago. Even camels were used in the Southwest. Jefferson Davis, who was Secretary of War before the Civil War, thought of that idea. And of course, there's people living down, an Indian tribe living down at the base of the Grand Canyon. And 3 days a week, all the mail and packages are loaded up on the mules and they're carried down the Grand Canyon. Post office got a little confused when it issued this stamp. The first stamp had a picture of the Grand Canyon, but they said it was in Colorado. So they reprinted the stamp, threw out the old one, reprinted the new ones, and they still made a mistake. This photograph is backwards. There's mail boats. You can still throw out a few mail boats up in Lake Winnipesaukee or up in Rangeley Lakes. And I remember as a kid at Christmas time getting mail twice a day. And most people did get mail twice a day until 1950. 1947 is considered the busiest year for the postal. But after 1950, mail was once a day. Then, of course, they automated the post office. First automation was down in Rhode Island. And then they instituted, if you remember this song by Elvis Presley, no such number, no such zone. Zone is what they use in cities to differentiate neighborhoods, but it was replaced by zip codes. And all zip code means is zone improvement plan. And there was a lot of publicity to get people to use zip codes. Even Ethel Merman was hired to sing some zip code. There were zip code games, coffee mugs, Dick Tracy, a big effort. And in a few years, everybody was using zip codes. And then in 1969, the post office faces a big crisis. Mail is getting slower and slower. The mailmen in New York City and some other cities are going on strike because of the low wages. So the Congress comes up with a reorganization act, takes the post office away from the government, makes it a semi-independent organization. Richard Nixon signs the legislation, and the post office is now operating in a different way than it had since George Washington's days. Then in 2006, there were people trying to make the post office completely private. They passed a law that the post office had to pay its pensions in advance, which no other organization in government had to do. And that quickly created a big deficit for the post office. But there are suggestions for improving and getting more money into the post office. These are some suggestions that have recently been written. Have a paycheck cashing system at a low rate. Have an actual savings and checking accounts. They do this in Europe. Put ATM machines in the post offices and see if people can pay their bills through the post office. Electric vehicles. There is a 10-year, $600 million effort to upgrade or get new postal vehicles, and they're encouraging them to be electric, provide internet services, especially in rural areas, and keep the post offices open longer, although now they seem to be closing more. So there was one little idea to save the post office, and that was to print a very tiny stamp and get 100 stamps on a sheet rather than 50, but it wasn't too popular. The stamps were too small. Okay, that's it. I keep us within our time. Yep, before 3. Sorry, I went a little long. So let's do the quick Henrys. Then I'll open it up for questions if you can stay around. So if you did make a list of Henrys, I'd like to read my list. Of course, you know Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was the first poet to be on an American stamp. He was on a 1-cent stamp. And interestingly, a little piece of trivia, back then all 1-cent stamps were green and all 2-cent stamps were red. But these are the ones I have. Famous man named Henry Clay, Henry Ford, our neighbor Henry David Thoreau, over in England, Henry VIII, took a middle name of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. One of our presidents had a middle name Henry, William Henry Harrison. John Henry, a famous folk hero. Henry Stanley, the man who just found Dr. Livingstone in the jungles of Africa. An author who wrote some rather bawdy books in England, Henry Fielding. Henry Lawson is an Australian poet. Henry Knox, familiar with Fort Knox, named after him. Henry Mancini, who wrote the Pink Panther song and also the theme for Peter Gunn. Of course, the famous explorer Henry Hudson. Henry Luce, who started Time magazine and Life magazine. The author, O. Henry, it's not his real name, his pen name. Interestingly, I collect stamps of people who have been in jail. famous people who've gone to jail, like Henry David Thoreau, like Martin Luther King, like Mahatma Gandhi, although Henry went to jail for a few years for embezzlement. There's a famous African American artist, Henry Tanner, an impressionist, and a man named Henry Arnold, who was a only person to be two generals, once in the army during the war, and then as a general when the Air Force was formed. And a new stamp just came out about the author, Henry James. So those are my Henrys. I hope you found some of them. So, all right, if you have any information want to do privately, please feel free to email the museum. Please check out our website. We've updated rather regularly with information. Don't forget that calendar. If you're interested, you can send again asking to info. And if you have any stamps sitting around the house, you want to have them evaluated, we do that for a fee of
You do
$50.
foreign stamps?
We'll do your whole collection.